how they can use sort of Ximalaya to benefit their business in China. One of the things is probably they're going to be concerned is, let's say they are not, really in China yet, or they're really thinking about going to China, and they may not be doing the podcast in Chinese, but you said that they can do it in English, and there's a huge amount of listener for that. Can you sort of elaborate a little bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. So when you look at the 500 million listeners on Ximalaya, sure, the answer is the majority of them are mostly listening to Chinese podcasts. But even if it's a sliver of them, a small percentage of them, and right now, by the way, I emailed Ximalaya, they couldn't really put their pulse on exactly what the percentage of people are, and it's changing very quickly. Let's just use a rough number of even 10% of the people on Ximalaya are listening to English podcasts. You're looking at a really big number.
Million,
right? 10% of that. So, that is 50 million right there instead of 500 million. And so the reason I want to say that, number one, overseas Chinese like myself are listening to Ximalaya. I noticed this even with my Chinese colleagues that I worked with in advertising companies. I remember we'll be our desk. I look over, it's like, yep, they're on Ximalaya. We actually help each other discover the shows that are interesting, and we feel like we are really in tune with what's going on. Meanwhile, being 8,000 miles away, right? So that's number one. Number two, there is a huge trend. If you ever get to travel to China, you will notice that back in the day, 20, 30 years ago, meaning people our age, we started learning English sort of in elementary school, but it became a very serious thing by the time we entered middle school around the age of 12. Now, if you are in China right now raising children and your child is learning English at the age of 12, you'll never catch up again. People will literally laugh at you because kids are learning English at the age of 6 months or 1 year old. And that means they're learning English at the exact same time as they're learning Chinese. And in fact, you can even find podcasts on Ximalaya with moms training their kids how to speak English. Well, meanwhile, the mom's English is not all that great, but, she's trying and trying to create that environment for the kids. And also there's a third cohort, not just kids, who are using Ximalaya to learn English, but also adults of various ages in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, especially because unlike people in our situation who then, sort of grew up or studied in the US and Canada, a lot of them, after leaving college at the age of 22, 23, they may just end up working for a Chinese company. And they, at that point, they have forgotten most of the English that they learned. And then at the same time, for other people who work for European, American, North American companies, they want to really improve their English beyond just a few words here and there and kind of mingling with coworkers, once a week. So yeah, it's a lot of people in short.
Yeah, no, I can definitely protest to learn English. So English is a huge thing in China. I mean, it's funny because we're as I'm gonna be back in October in Shanghai. I'm taking two of my daughter. One is much younger, which my second daughter is about 5.5. And, my wife's obviously taught to people back there, and it's like, oh, your daughter's never going to keep up. I'm like, okay. Because the kids there, like, literally goes to, after school program since they're like, 6 months old?
All kinds of courses, not just English, but English is a required after school program. That's for sure.
Yeah, no. I'm like, oh, that's okay. I don't want her to go to Gaokao anyway, so that's okay. But yeah, no, absolutely. So China is extremely aggressive with the English. So I can definitely see how people are using this to improve their English for sort of, for professional as well as helping their kids or even themselves to be able to communicate better in English. So, but I guess the question would be do you think there's potential for business to sort of leverage this in any way? If people are listening to, say, English stuff, are they really interested in, say, listening to something that, that may be like what you do, teaching people how to do podcasts or in a more professional sense of thing?
Yeah. So the good news is right now it's more challenging to find proof points that say, oh, so and so purchased this course because she has listened to this podcast on Ximalaya, and this is how much she paid for it. We have some data points, but not really enough to condense a ton of people and just make it look trivial. What I'll say is, so there's one element that's worth calling out is the issue of firewall. So yes, even if somebody is based in China, can theoretically get on iTunes, right, or just use any of the North American apps and start listening to podcasts by Tim Ferriss or Pat Flynn or whoever. However, when I was in China trying to download these podcasts, and keep in mind that a lot of these higher production quality podcast episodes are fairly large in size.
Right.
We're talking about a minimum of 50 megabytes, and a lot of them, like my own shows, over an hour, it's over 100 megabytes, and some even more, depending on how many bells and whistles you put in the show. So that is actually challenging to download and listen to smoothly if you're in China. So for a certain population who don't want to be bothered with firewall, and sometimes it can be challenging to kind of using a VPN to access this type of content, they would prefer Ximalaya. And this is precisely why, if you have a show already, or even if you don't have one, you should definitely consider Ximalaya as a destination, as people you can target, because Chinese people can easily, very, very easily get on Ximalaya. And don't get me wrong, we have 4G in North America, which is relatively fast, right? 4G moving on to 5G. In China, they're already at 5G. And in some areas that I heard there are 6Gs. I don't
know about that, but okay.
6Gs, but that's already in like beta testing. That's like what everybody was talking about. So I used my mom's phones and realized that how speedy everything is, especially with listening to podcasts. I will also say this, that within the 10% of the people who understand and would prefer listening to English podcasts, there's a good number of them are very business savvy. And I got this information firsthand from Ximalaya, who reached out to me after they found out about the course I created, and actually said, we have a plan, which is the plan is reality now, as they build brand new office in San Francisco for their sort of North America branch, trying to replicate the success of Ximalaya. And between you and me, for everybody who's listening, that's going to be very, very challenging. So yeah, there is an audience waiting and hungry for your content.
Yeah, so I mean that's actually a very interesting point, because I mean technically, if we go to some big podcasters like Tim Ferriss, who doesn't have any Chinese podcast, or you can technically just say, well, would you like to repurpose that on Ximalaya? And then then people can reach his sort of podcast a lot easier in China, and it's a sizable audience, right? Even based on what he's already doing really well here, so he can really sort of leverage that just by sort of repurposing it in English. On Ximalaya.
Yeah. All right. I think you brought up something else a lot of people don't often think about, and will help their podcast tremendously, is to consider, perhaps if it's a pure English podcast, consider translating even the description to text, so that when people go to your channel, they realize that what this is about without that initial language barrier. I will also say there's a gentleman whose first language is certainly not Chinese, who is American, and who admits that his Chinese is very limited because his role is dealing with a lot of Chinese companies. He's worked with a Chinese company for a very long time. His accent is very heavy. However, he decided to record his intro, like episode 0 on Ximalaya, in Chinese, and you could tell he was clearly struggling. However, it resonated with so many Chinese people. There were like, a dozen comments that came in right away to say, you did a great job, and it's so good. I was like, really? I mean, I love my friend, but it's Chinese is certainly not all the way there.
Right. No, I completely understand that. I mean, that's interesting, because it's really sort of Chinese people looking, wow, he's really making an effort to be part of our culture, to be part of our sort of community, which is something that's very welcome in China. That's for sure, to having that patriotic feel for Chinese people.
So true.